بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين أجل الله تعالى فرجه الشريف وجعلنا من أعوانه وأنصاره. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, we are given this tawfiq and opportunity by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to witness another month of Muharram. And this is a great opportunity to increase our understanding and knowledge of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and inshallah to try to resemble Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam in their values, inshallah, more. Muharram is the occasion which has no replacement or substitute for us as individuals and also for our community. And for sure, without Muharram, we could not have continued this line of fellowship and this line of loyalty to the causes of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. So we are deeply grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for giving us this tawfiq, and we pray at the same time to guide us and inspire us to understand the best way of mourning for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. What inshallah I am going to study and discuss in these nights is to see how we can get involved into a spiritual struggle or spiritual process of uplifting ourselves based on the values exhibited by Imam Hussein alayhi salam and his followers. And inshallah, this would not be just an occasion in which we commemorate what happened. It would also be something for us, inshallah, to apply to our lives and to change, inshallah, our lives, not just something, that we emotionally feel and we just do it for the sake of mourning. I hope that inshallah brothers and sisters who are here share with me also their ideas, their comments afterwards, either in person or sending notes or emails or whatever. So inshallah we all together would engage in this process of familiarizing ourselves more with some of the aspects of spirituality of Karbala, inshallah. So I don't assume that I have everything ready. For me, it's a process of thinking and learning, and inshallah this should be done all together with all of us. Tonight, I want to reflect on the concept of mourning or azadari, and we want to see what does it really mean if we are mourning for someone, and in this particular case, what does it mean to be mourning for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. A little bit tonight maybe too philosophical, but please bear with me because this is very important to inshallah lay the foundation for our discussions for coming nights. Before I start talking about this, I should give you a general idea that in our life we always have two things which are very closely connected and related, but in reality they are different, and if we are not careful, we may get confused. Sometimes we have a value, and this value is the essence and the core which we appreciate, which we admire, which we are ready to do every sacrifice for that. But at the same time, we have ways and manners of expressing that value or showing love to that value, which can be very different. It can be different from one person to another person, from one society to another society. It can change over time, and it's not necessarily all the time sacred. So these two things have to be separated and distinguished. For example, one value which we all hold to be very important, especially in the followers of Abrahamic faith, in Islam, Judaism, Christianity, is the value of hospitality. To be hospitable, to be a good host is very important. We always look at a guest as a person who brings Allah's mercy to our house. There is a hadith which is very moving and striking, which says that whoever believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the hereafter should honor his or her guest. Man kana yu'minu billah wal yawmil akhir falyukrim dhayfah. So if you have a guest, this guest is a sign, is a test for your iman. How you treat your guest shows how mu'min you are, how good you are in your iman. This is a very strong statement. And this is what the Prophet said to Lady Fatima, salamullah alayha. This great value of hospitality can be shown in different ways. For example, sometimes you have a guest and you provide your guest with food. So to provide with food can be a sign of you looking after your guest properly. But sometimes in another society, they may have this value of hospitality, but they are not very determined to always offer food. So you find this difference when you visit, different countries. Sometimes you go and you see that people, bring you all the, food, all the, for example, refreshments, everything. Then you go to another country, they bring you nothing. Even, recently I was in a place I don't want to mention. They didn't even bring us water. This doesn't mean that they don't have this value. If you ask them, they talk about the value of hospitality, but it doesn't necessarily mean and require to give food. For them, the fact that they have given you their time and they are available to you and they listen to you and they respect you is hospitality. But for us as Muslims and also people from East, it's very important to always, give a food, or at least, fruit and, some sweets and, some tea. This is part of our hospitality. So you see that there is one common value, but then there are different ways of showing this. Or for example, to be a good guest, This is something that everyone accepts. I don't think you find any person in the world who says that when you are a guest, you can be a troublemaker, or you can be a mischief maker, you can do whatever you want. They always say no, there are etiquettes that you have to observe. You have to be a good guest. But then, how you show this can be different. For example, in some societies, when the host brings you food, you should make sure that you eat all the food which is offered, at least everything which is in your plate. You have to eat it. If you don't eat everything, then the host may be offended. Oh, my food was not delicious. He didn't like this. This is why he has left half of the food. If you are not careful, then that person feels very sad. So even if you don't have appetite, or it's too much for you, you have to eat more so that that person is happy that the food was enjoyable. In some other cultures, it's different. You have to leave part of the food so that the person knows the food was enough. So for them, it's very important that food is enough. If you eat all of it, that person thinks that, oh, maybe he wanted more. So there is a problem here. If you are not familiar with cultures, you can get confused. Or for example, when they bring you tea, if you drink the tea, in some societies, they don't bring you next unless they ask you. Do you want more? Say yes, or you say no, thanks. So it's very clearly decided. In some societies, as soon as you drink and your cup is empty, they bring you another one. So you have to drink it. If you don't drink it, they say, why you are not using this? If you don't want more, you have to put cup upside down. So this is different cultures. Even in driving, you have different, cultures. Not only regulations, traffic regulations can be different. Also, cultures can be different. Here in the UK, for example, if you want to give a signal to the driver who comes from opposite that, you can come and don't worry, you can, for example, proceed, you give a flash. In some other countries, if you give a flash, it means that don't come. Be careful, I am coming. So it can be sometimes very dangerous. So these different ways of showing the same principle or same value or same idea is part of human culture. You have diversity of cultures, you have diversity of ways of expression. When it comes to love, when it comes to emotions, it's the same, if not even, much more obvious. People love, for example, their parents. In every society, people love their parents. But how they show this love? In some societies, they love their parents, so they show it by being very nice to them, very polite. They kiss their hand of their father and mother. They do everything. In some society, they love their parents, but they don't show it so obviously. Their emotions are, perhaps somehow hidden or not easily expressed. Or when you go to the airport and you want to say goodbye, in some cultures, they cry, you see the tears coming, they cannot say goodbye. It takes them, maybe half an hour, 1 hour to say goodbye. In some societies, easily they say goodbye. This doesn't mean there is no love. It means that there are different ways of expressing this love. Last year, I attended a funeral in Canada, a friend who was a Christian professor, and we had dialogues with each other. So he had passed away, and it happened that I wasn't there for Ramadan, so I said I must go and attend the funeral. And you could see that everyone is sad, especially the family members. He was a very nice man, and for sure his loss was, very much making everyone sad. But something very interesting, or something which drew my attention, was that in the funeral in the church, when his body was right there outside the hall, the family members came, and they were very deeply, sad, but they started joking. They started mentioning some funny memories of that person. Some of the mistakes he did, some of, the funny habits he had. So someone who was not familiar would think that, oh, these people have no mercy, these people have no love. But this was not the case. They were somehow hiding the deep sadness, and they didn't want people, to cry. But for us, it's different. We think that this is an occasion in which, even if you are not sad, like for example, friends or neighbors who may not be that sad, they should pretend at least to be sad. No one should make jokes. This is, very strange. If we have a funeral and someone makes jokes, or for example, they brought a singing group and they sang the music that he loved. This is the way they showed their respect to the dead person. And for us, it's quite different. We don't do it like this. Or sometimes, for example, people may dress white, some people may dress black. Different ways of expressing their sadness. So, there are two different things. One is the core value. Another thing is how you express it. I give one more example, then I reflect on the concept of mourning. In the time of the Iranian king Dariush, he was informed, and this is reported by Herodotus, Greek historian, famous Greek historian. He was reported that in his empire, which at that time was extended to India and from west included part of Europe, including Greece, he was informed that in Greece, people burn their dead bodies. If someone's father, for example, dies, they burn. At the same time, he was informed that in India, there are people who eat the body of their dead, relatives. He was shocked because in central part where he was staying, that was not a common practice. No one was burning or eating. So he asked them to come. Representatives from both cultures came to his palace, and he started talking to them. So he said to the people that used to eat, how much should I give you so that you give up this? And instead of eating, you burn. He said, oh, how can I burn my father when he's died? When he's dead, how can I burn him? This is disrespectful. So he said, so why do you eat? He says, I eat because I want the body of my father become part of my body. So in me, he can continue to exist. So he becomes part of my flesh and blood, and then my father is alive. Then he asked the people who used to burn, are you able to give up this? They said, no. He said, so if I give you some money, are you going to stop? They said, no. He said, so why you burn? They said, because we don't want the body of our dead relatives to spoil. We don't want, to smell bad or, be, spoiled. We burn it so that it remains always pure, and then we can keep the ashes and so on and so forth. So he realized that there's a big difference and they're not ready to compromise. People, even today, moral philosophers, when they comment on this story, they have different ways of commenting on this story. Some people say this shows that there is no common value. So they argue for relativity. They say there are different ways of having value for the dead people. But when we think about it carefully, we realize that there is no difference in the value. The moral value which was involved is to be respectful to the dead person. Do you find they disagreed on this? No, they didn't disagree on this. They both agreed that they should do their best to show their respect to the dead person. But how did they show this respect? That was different. Depending on their worldview, on their beliefs, on their customs, on their culture, they had different ways to express this. But none of them thought that we should not respect, we should not bother about someone who is dead. So there is a common value. Okay, so we have to have in our mind a clear distinction between two things. A value or a principle that is sacred for us, that is very significant for us, and different ways and forms and manners of expressing that, or practicing that, or showing that. These are two separate things. Now, when we talk about the concept of mourning for Imam Hussein alayhi salam, the same distinction has to be made. And unfortunately, in many cases, people who have been doing this mourning for ages, they haven't made this distinction in their mind. So they extend the qualities of one to the other without knowing that this doesn't work. What is the essence of mourning for Imam Hussein alayhi salam is different from different ways of expressing that and practicing that. You can express it, you can practice it according to your own culture, according to your own customs. You may do it by, for example, having a session in which you remember the tragic events. You may have it by, for example, having a procession. You may do it, for example, by having different, for example, ways of dressing your house or your gatherings, different types of colors you may use, different, for example, songs you may use. You may do many, many different things. Maybe there are even ways that yet we have not tried. We have to be also innovative and creative, in the ways of expressing this. Sometimes people give, blood. Sometimes people give water. There are many different ways of showing this concept of mourning. And inshallah, I will make this more clear. And they can be all respected. They can be all appreciated. If there is one way that, for example, a person from Iran or a person from Pakistan or Iraq or Lebanon or India, if they have different ways of doing this, none of them should think that my way of doing this is better or everyone must do like me. No, it can be very different. And yours can be as good as the others. And sometimes yours may be wrong. Although mourning for Imam Hussein is a great value, but your way of showing that may be wrong. Like the respect for the dead people, which was right, but burning or eating was not right. So there are different ways of expressing and practicing this mourning. They can be as right and as valid as each other, or some of them can be better. Some of them can be still, coming in future that we haven't yet tried, and you cannot say because we have never had things like this in the past, so we don't do it. But the essence is something else. And that essence is something that you must not compromise. That is something that you have to preserve. Unfortunately, most of the time, our focus is shifted from that essence to that ways of expressing that, and this becomes sacred for us, and we pay all the attention to the second and we forget the first. This looks, sometimes very unacceptable. It's like what? For example, who is a doctor? A doctor is the one who has knowledge of medicine and is available and willing to help the ill people for their treatment. How do you do this? There are many different things. You may put on a white dress. You may have, some equipments with you. You may, for example, go and, first shake hand, or some people may not shake hand. There are different ways, people do it. Some people who have no knowledge of a job like a medical doctor, they think these things are to be a doctor. So they think just to put on a white dress and, shake hand and say, what is your illness? And just writing something, this is medicine. Like children. Children, they think by doing this, they become a doctor. They don't realize that this is just the ways that a doctor may look, or may, express, or may exercise his job. But this is not to be a doctor. That is something else. Or for example, who is an alim? If someone is not familiar, he said the alim is the one who has a turban. But then everyone can put a turban on his head. So he becomes alim. For some people, yes. Everyone who has a turban is an alim. They don't investigate about the history of that person, about knowledge of that person. They just accept. Why? Because this person has a turban. Is it enough? No. This is the ways that ulama appear. But not whoever appears like this in alim. Okay? So, the true mourners for Imam Hussein alayhi salam, they appear in a way that is not the same as being a mourner. So just by appearing like them, you don't become a mourner. You understand the difference? So you can bring today 10 players. They say you want to make a movie. What is your movie about? About the way the Shia do mourning for Imam Hussein. Okay, they do everything like you, maybe even better than you. They can cry better than you because they are, actors. They cry better than you. They, put a special, black dress, everything better than you. But do they become mourners for Imam Hussein? No. They do everything like you, but they are not mourners for Imam Hussein. What is lacking? That essence which I'm going to explain. So for us, it's very important to realize what is the essence of mourning for Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and then we should enrich and strengthen that. In my understanding, the true essence of mourning for Imam Hussein alayhi salam is to express in public your sadness for the loss of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So there are two major elements here. One is that you have to be sad. If you do everything without being sad, you are not a mourner. If you hit your head or do many other things that I don't want to mention, but in your heart you are not sad, this is not a mourner. You have to feel very sad. But at the same time, you have to express it in public. So if I am sad, but no one knows about this, so this is not azadari. Azadari must be something that other people can see, something that can be felt. So you express your sadness. If you hide your sadness, this is not azadari. So you have to express your sadness in public. How do you express? That is another issue. We will talk about it later. But sadness and expression of sadness in public are two essential things. Without them, we don't have mourning. We don't have azadari. This sadness can become stronger and stronger, depending how sorry you are, how sorrowful you are, how grieved you are. Then you can go through different levels. The high level of sadness is when you cry. If you are sad to a limited extent, you cannot cry. You know, sometimes you see, for example, on TV, a sad picture or sad, clip or video or something. For example, there are poor people who are starving. So you become sad. But sometimes you are deeply affected, you cry. Sometimes tears come from your eyes. This is where your sadness has grown and has reached its peak. So crying by itself is not essential. So if someone cannot cry, shouldn't say that, okay, I have lost everything, I am not a mourner for Imam Hussein. No, as we have in our hadith, if you cannot cry, at least do tabaki, at least show yourself as a person who is in grief. Because as I said, the essential point is sadness and grief. But for sure, someone who cries and someone whose tears come shows that he has been more affected. He is more sorry and more sorrowful. Okay? So this is why we have many hadiths about the merits of crying for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. For example, there is a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. In which the Prophet said, Ya Fatima, kullu aynin bakiyatun yawm al-qiyamah illa aynun bakat ala masa'ib al-Husayn. Every eye would be crying on the Day of Judgment. Means would not be happy. Except the eye that has cried over the tragedy of Hussein alayhi salam. فَإِنَّهَا ضَاحِكَةٌ مُسْتَبْشِرَةٌ بِالنَّعِيمِ الْجَنَّةِ. But that eye that has cried for Hussein would be happy and in a very joyful situation, and would be given the good news of heaven. So, this crying is very important. But, as I said, sadness is the essence. If someone cries, why? Because, for example, at the same time that he or she hears about the tragedy of Karbala, he or she is reminded of her own problems. So we talked about, for example, Imam Hussein's, for example, loss in his son. Then he had a son and he remembers and starts crying, not for necessarily Imam Hussein, but for his own son. Or for example, if someone has great debt, cannot pay mortgage, this kind of thing, it's a good time to cry. So this is different. This is not that cry which is the result of sadness. Or sometimes there are people who are professional reciters, and actually too professional, because if you are a professional reciter, you should make people more aware of what is the case. So sometimes there are people who are so-called professional. They use different techniques to put you into crying mood. Different music, different tones, different ways. Just they think that if people start crying, they have achieved. Ayatollah Mutahari says in one of his books that even there were people who used to throw stones at people so that they cry. I feel hurt, so I start crying. Say, oh, this person is crying in the majlis for imams. This crying is not as such important. There are people who can easily cry. What is important is that sadness. Yes, if naturally that sadness leads to crying, that's very good. But if you bypass that sadness and then start crying, that is not useful. Okay. What is the cause of that sadness? This is something that, inshallah, we are going to explore tomorrow. That is ma'rifah. That is knowledge. That is understanding. That is what we have in hadith about the people who visit Imam Hussein alayhi salam and they know him properly. Haqqul ma'rifah. They have proper understanding of merits of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And then, inshallah, I will explain that this ma'rifah must not be only ma'rifah of Imam Hussein alayhi salam with respect to the last few days or last few weeks of the life of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. If you want to have proper ma'rifah of Imam Hussein, inshallah, we will see that that proper ma'rifah of Imam Hussein makes your whole life different. Makes your life a life which we say in Ziyarat Ashura, Allahumma ja'al mahyaya mahya Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa mamati mamata Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad. So part of this struggle that we have to get involved is to achieve that haqqul ma'rifah. If you achieve that proper understanding and familiarity and acquaintance with Imam Hussein alayhi salam, then you don't need to pressurize yourself to feel sad or to cry. Indeed, you cannot stop crying. You don't need, people to use, different methods and techniques to put you into tears. It happens automatically. And then, inshallah, we will talk about the difference between a mourner for Imam Hussein alayhi salam and a person who is united with Imam Hussein alayhi salam, which is the high level of a mourner. He's not just mourning, he feels that this is something which has happened to himself. So inshallah we will talk about this in coming nights. I want to end our talk tonight with few hadiths, and these hadiths are helpful to understand the significance of mourning for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And then a small poem in Farsi with English translation. One of the things that seems to be exclusive to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and some ulama have mentioned this as one of the exclusive things to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, is that he was cried for even before his birth. Normally, when someone is killed or dies or passes away, then people start crying. But Imam Hussein alayhi salam, right from the time of his birth, received this kind of, attitude of crying for him. For example, the late Ibn Babawi says that Safiya, who was the daughter of Abdul Muttalib and one of the aunts of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is buried in Baqi, she says that I was helping with the delivery of Imam Hussein. I was helping Lady Fatima, and as soon as Imam was born, the Prophet said, bring me my child. So he said, I took Imam Hussein to the Prophet, and the Prophet was crying, and while he was crying, he kissed between two eyes of the baby, Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And he prayed against the killers of Imam Hussein. He cursed the killers of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And Safiya says, I asked the Prophet, who are the killers of Hussein? And the Prophet said, they are the unjust people from Bani Umayyah. So right at the time of birth, that everyone, is happy, because the Prophet knows about what is going to happen to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He cannot stop crying. If he could, he would have not cried in public to make other people sad. And we have similar hadiths about other members of Ahlul Bayt doing similar things. There is another hadith that one day the Prophet was in the house of Lady Salama, who was a very good lady, very pious lady. And the Prophet said, don't let anyone come to me. So the Prophet wanted to have some private, time for himself. But Salama says that Imam Hussein, who was a child, went towards the Prophet, and I couldn't stop him. He didn't, stop and ask for permission. He just went in. So he says Imam Hussein went to the place that the Prophet, was there, and I followed him, and I saw that the Prophet has put Imam Hussein on his chest and was crying. And then the Prophet said, O Salama, Gabriel has brought me the news that my child Hussein would be killed. And then the Prophet gave me some soil and said, whenever this soil turns into blood, that is the time that my child is killed. And Salama kept this soil, and on the day of Ashura, when Salama was not there, but in distance, she realized that Imam was killed because the soil was turned into blood. So, before his martyrdom, the Prophet and Imam Ali, there is, also a story about Imam Ali crossing, Karbala and on the way to Siffin or coming back and cried. Many stories like this. So this shows that Imam was, even before his martyrdom, was a source of feeling very sorry and sorrowful. Even there are hadiths which says even before his birth, not only after his birth, even before his birth, previous prophets mourned for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. For example, there is a hadith which is in Bihar al-Anwar, volume 10, page 56, that when Adam came to the earth and descended to the earth, he was going around, perhaps exploring different parts of the earth, and at one point he visited Karbala. But he didn't know what is Karbala and what is going to happen here. But without having control, he started crying. So he asked for explanation. He asked, what is the reason? And then he had a call that this is the land in which your son, from your progeny, Hussein, would be killed unjustly. He said, "O Allah, who is Hussein? Is he a prophet?" And he was told, no, he is not a prophet, but he is the son of the prophet of end of the time, Akhir al-Zaman, who is Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. Then he asked, "O Allah, who is the killer of Hussein?" Perhaps he couldn't believe that there can be a human being who can kill the son of the prophet of Akhir al-Zaman. Who is that person? The answer was, he is called Yazid. So he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep Yazid away from his mercy, to curse Yazid, and then after that he left Karbala. And we have this about other prophets. So this is one of the exclusive things about Imam Hussein alayhi salam, that crying for him and feeling sorry for his martyrdom was a common practice of the prophets. And this started from the beginning of history of mankind and is going to continue till end of life of humanity. So mourning for Imam Hussein is equal to the whole lifespan of humanity. So this is very striking. This is something very important. So inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala includes us among the true mourners of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And I just end with this poem, which is the way that the poet explains the love for Imam Hussein that he has, and the hope that he has that this love for Imam Hussein would help him in the time that he is in the greatest need. And that is when we are going to die. That is when no one can help you. No matter, how educated you are, how rich you are, how many people are there to support you. A time would come that no one can help you. You are in the greatest need. What can help you is what you achieve in these occasions. How you attach yourself to Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam so that they can come and help you